Starfield, the gaming equivalent of finding out the Nigerian prince you've been sending your life savings to is in fact Todd Howard, the final boss of scamming. To say lifelong Bethesda fans like myself were disappointed by Starfield is the understatement of the century. Despite some discontent about the base game of Fallout 4, the level of negativity surrounding the release of Starfield is unprecedented for any mainline Bethesda game released in the last 2 decades. On a personal level, as a lifelong fan of Bethesda titles, I was eager to find out why Starfield imploded so completely upon takeoff, and so shortly after my first playthrough, I made a video on why Starfield as a package fails to deliver on the promise of its conception. But I felt that taking the broad brush approach this required prevented me from addressing the most glaring deficiency of the game, the pronouns.
I love nothing more than to be dragged out!
I'm joking. Chill. Calm down, don't get too freaked out. It's the quest design. Like any long-time Bethesda fan, I wasn't expecting Starfield to inaugurate a revolution in quest design and storytelling. Let's be honest, at this point, prioritizing everything over evolving their storytelling is more Bethesda than Todd Howard lying.
It's an epic about hope, our shared humanity, and answering our greatest mystery.
With the exception of Morrowind, in Bethesda titles, bugs are easier to find than meaningful choices and consequences. They've built a brand not on revolutionizing open world design, but somehow tapping into mysterious, intangible magic that enables them to simultaneously create immensely enjoyable, expansive and intricately detailed worlds that are completely and consistently anachronistic in design. And because of this curious Bethesda magic, despite always releasing games with major flaws on paper, most of their titles have managed to retain a strange hold over gamers, including myself, to this day. We were more or less willing to accept slightly dated quest design and less than interesting narrative choices because we got so much in return. On a personal level, Skyrim drew me in so completely with its enthralling, almost meditative atmosphere and sheer wintry beauty that despite its many issues, I believe it still remains an all-time great, even in its base game form. Starfield, on the other hand, was not just archaic, but downright boring. In my last video on Starfield, I explained by how subcontracting exploration to a bunch of menus and prioritizing scope above everything, Bethesda sapped their magic out of Starfield, leaving an empty husk that felt tedious to play. But I believe this focus on scope without substance had a much greater effect, and this is what this video will focus on. In removing all that was great about Bethesda games, Starfield unwittingly highlighted just how bad Bethesda's storytelling and quest design is. To put it bluntly, Starfield's quest design is irredeemably awful and unacceptably terrible for a studio with a financial backing of one of our massive tech overlords. And without the veneer of exploration, this deficiency defines Starfield as a game. Therefore, for me, to really dissect the poor quality of Starfield, you need to look at the quests, even if similar criticism could be thrown at Skyrim or Fallout, because it lacks anything else. There is no exploration focus to highlight. There is no atmosphere. And I believe the simplest way to do this is by coming up with a recipe for good open world game design and comparing it to Starfield. In my opinion, great open world quests must achieve 4 things. They have to maintain the illusion of player freedom, fit in with the narrative of the player character, provide interesting choices and consequences that intertwine with the world, and perhaps above all else, be underpinned by stellar writing. Traditionally, Bethesda have been very good at 1, inconsistent with 2, and less than stellar with 3 and 4. The importance of number 1 and 2 stem from a distinctly open world feature, non-linearity. You see, in a true open world, players have the freedom to tackle the game how they want to, rather than how the game explicitly dictates. Within reason, of course. This forces developers to ensure that the game is not only saturated with content, but that this content is both interesting and well distributed. In an ideal world, no matter how far the player ventures off the beaten path, they should not be punished for curiosity. Otherwise, the experience would become linear as the right way to play emerges, effectively rendering open world design pointless. Maintaining this ideal open world, however, is easier said than done, as it opens up a number of difficult challenges for developers when combined with other expectations. For one, it's very difficult to maintain strong character narrative storytelling without sacrificing this illusion of freedom. Complex narratives with intertwining story threads must have different outcomes and character interactions, that take into account radically different choices one player may take from another. And these different scenarios must be conceptualized and developed by human beings, who are limited by time and resources, and thus the possibilities of player choice cannot literally be limitless. At the same time, this illusion of limitless freedom is at the heart of open worlds, and without which the appeal of them falls flatter than the Twin Towers. So player choice cannot be restricted so much that it shatters this most fundamental illusion common to both open worlds and liberal democracy. Some developers attempt to solve this dilemma by creating barriers to player exploration that almost trick the average player into believing their meaningful choices are not limited by a bunch of neckbeards on Zoom. A good example of well-regarded attempts to solve this issue is the open world of New Vegas. In the game, Obsidian subtly directs players to take a certain pathway while theoretically leaving an open map. It does this by placing higher enemies in regions far off the beaten track to dissuade players from traveling there. CD Projekt Red in The Witcher 3 similarly maintains this illusion of freedom, but through a more crude mechanism: recommended level caps. Quests and regions the studio wanted the player to access at a later date are separated into tiers, and accordingly campaigns tend to operate on a more linear terrain without actually feeling like it. Others, like Ubisoft Montreal and Ubisoft Toronto and Ubisoft Milan, you get the point, abandoned the whole, making interesting content business and tried instead to maintain the illusion of freedom by oversaturating their maps with boring, repetitive content, filling player inventories and maps with miscellaneous nonsense. However, apart from being the gaming equivalent of promising a reveal and then releasing a 5-minute long cinematic trailer, this approach also runs a tremendous risk of crashing into a second hurdle developers have to face: how to balance high stakes with the illusion of narrative realism. Let's be real, we gamers want everything. We want to feel as though our player is naturally drawn into side stories because of who they know, who they are, and where they are, and not because the developers have decided that we are the main character and therefore get to break all the rules of the Matrix.
Motion capture, baby.
For us to really appreciate content chained to predetermined laws we do not control, we must be able to suspend our disbelief and wholeheartedly embrace the simulation. At the same time, we want stakes and exciting narratives that completely break with the reality of our lives. You see, life is boring. Most people have routines that others would find extremely uninterested. We're so boring that even reality TV is fake. Therefore, to give us a reason to absorb hours of character dialogue and deal with what is often going to be going from A to B without seppuku, developers have to subtly balance realism with creativity. Usually, this paradox is solved in two ways. The first is factions. Factions are useful at maintaining this illusion because they allow for gradual escalation of the player's role from low to high stakes. We are less likely to question our character playing a prominent role in high stakes factional conflicts if we've seen them go from a distrustive novice to a high level member through our own graft. In Starfield, a good example of this would be the Ryujin Industries questline. You can buy to an extent that your character will be tasked with increasingly high stakes because you've seen their progression from a coffee runner to institutional player. The second way developers ensure quests feel as though they make sense for your character and the world in which they inhabit has much more to do with their background. For us to accept that in-game characters would trust us, most often a stranger, with all these fun and exciting tasks with interesting twists and turns, not to mention often tremendous consequences, there has to be some reason as to why the character would either know people involved in these scenarios or would be trusted to carry out tasks. Otherwise, the illusion that our character exists in a coherent universe is broken. And so developers often give the player some sort of familiarity, ability, ailment, or chosen one fate that distinguishes them from others. The Witcher 3 is a perfect example of this type of storytelling done well. Geralt is an amazing protagonist because he not only has a well-established network of friends, enemies, and colleagues involved in an exciting high-stakes scenario, but has an obvious reason for strangers to trust him in all sorts of high-stakes activities, because he's a professional. As a Witcher in a world with a lot of monsters and very few slayers, he's a rare commodity. And not only do we know this as players, but it's obvious to NPCs. He literally carries his profession on his back, and thus giving NPCs a clear reason to assume that he is a Witcher. The two swords he openly carries and the medallion he drapes around his neck are universally recognizable features of the Witcher outfit that anyone from a peasant to a lord would be able to get. And so we can almost fool ourselves into believing that this random peasant who needs help was not placed in a made up world for our benefit, but was desperate for help and saw potential for salvation in a burly monster slayer. The lack of, what can you call this, simulated realism is a major problem with Starfield. Outside of factions, our character is an unknown, a nobody. They have no references for any of their claims, no outfits or ID to signify their status, and so when random NPCs ask us to deliver something or look for someone, it feels very gamified and artificial, like Bethesda came up with the quest line before they figured out how it would fit into the world. But it's not enough to ensure that quests are subtly integrated within a cohesive world and character narrative if they're boring. And this is where the third fundamental ingredient for quality open quest design comes into play: interesting choices and consequences. As I referenced earlier with Ubisoft's approach, even the laziest and most parasitic studios manage to find enough content under the sofa to pack a modern AAA game with more baggage than Boogie 2988. The problem with this approach, however, is that open worlds are so large that without content attaching meaning to parts of the map or creating a reason for player exploration, either players will simply ignore the map, in which case this experience might as well be linear, or they will simply find traversing through it forgettable at best and an unnecessary slog at worst. This is how worlds can be created that simultaneously feel overwhelmingly full and shockingly shallow at the same time. So competent developers try to instead pack the map with interesting stories dynamically integrated into the world map. But often, this is not enough. You see, this approach also creates another major issue. It turns open world storytelling into incredibly disjointed experiences. One moment we're on a time-sensitive world-ending mission, next we're helping some woman find her cat. This disconnect between the stakes of the main and side quests can remove the impact of high-stakes storytelling or make side content feel like an unnecessary impediment to our character's narrative journey. Effective developers resolve this conflict by introducing interesting choices and stakes into side quests that weave into or complement the main narrative. CD Projekt Red are masters of this approach, and they have partly displayed their mastery in The Witcher 3 and even most recently in The Phantom Liberty. But all the narrative complexity and tenant-like interweaving storylines are nothing without the final ingredient of quality quest design: stellar writing. As with most things in life, theories and concepts are nothing without execution. And with narrative-focused open-world storytelling, the execution is in the writing. A team of designers can concoct the most aesthetically pleasing and narratively interesting content possible, but without solid character writing and a coherent thematic tone, players will still feel as though something is missing. And don't get me on, oh, they can just add environmental storytelling. Most players won't get it. We need a narrative as well. Therefore, traditionally, this is the area developers of open world games have struggled with the most. You see, the more content you have, the harder it becomes to quality control or add depth. And therefore, your impulse to add more content and say your game has 500 hours of content or 100 hours that's so popular nowadays often contradicts your ability to provide quality in those hours. And so it almost feels as though there is nothing despite there being so much. And while we're on the topic of emptiness in abundance, I think it's a good time to transition over to Starfield and dismantle its open world quest design using these 4 principles. Before we start, I want to clarify that I'm not denying there aren't amazing quests in Starfield. I just haven't played them. I'm sure they exist in the vivid imagination of Todd Howard, where reality is an illusion and Fallout 76 is the greatest game of all time. No, I'm joking. I'm joking, of course. There are great moments. Like, come on, everyone loves the Mantis. Can't deny the Mantis, nor can you fight them. But a great game cannot be defined by moments, especially when they are few and far between in the space of a 1,000,000-hour playtime. It's ridiculous to tell gamers, guys, it's alright, just postpone meeting friends, family, and hentai for another 10 hours. And no quest, in my mind, most exemplifies Starfield's inconsistency and lack of depth than the Paradiso one. You know that one. The main quest in Paradiso, formerly titled First Contact, is a brilliant example of a quest that fails to meet all 4 conditions for a great open world quest. And before I go into that, I have to explain, I'm going to go into some spoilers, so if you haven't played through the game, log off now, you've been warned. Anyway, back to First Contact. It starts in the way many Starfield adventures do, a strange signal, which in this world devoid of actual exploration is the Bethesda equivalent of a random Ubisoft quest marker. And so we, intrigued by the promise of loot or a fascinating extraterrestrial adventure, our character, not yet driven to the depths of cynicism by the black heart of Todd Howard, decides to follow this signal and is greeted by humans. But plot twist, they're space Amish. Not only are our new friends unconnected to any existing space society, they represent a unique relic of the initial post-Earth exploration era. You see, instead of colonizing a nearby planet, the ancestors of this colony ship decided to set a direct course to a habitable planet that would take generations to reach with existing tech. However, because technology advanced far beyond the pace at which they conceived, others had already settled first and founded a corporate holiday spot known as Paradiso. Now, in and of itself, I don't have any real problems with this premise. Navigating the interests of the Paradiso Corporation and the colonists could have set up interesting moral conflicts with high stakes, interesting choices and consequences. And if these choices and consequences were combined with compelling character writing, this setup could have made for a legendary plot. However, in our universe, this was not meant to be. You see, its problems emerge from the very beginning of the questline. Our introduction to this new colony civilization doesn't start off that badly, to be honest. It makes sense that a group of individuals who were raised within the boundaries of a ship would be curious about an outsider and want to use them as a means to gain understanding about the current world. But this is the point where the whole thing stops making sense. You see, the crew isn't just interested in us as a means to gain information about the world or perhaps communicate with the outside. They do something that completely breaks the immersion of the questline. You see, after a brief positive interaction, the colony decides to entrust their entire fate to us, a random guy with no credentials, and of whom they know nothing about. And as I'll get onto later, these aren't minimal stakes, but it gets worse. The same happens on the other side. After entering the ship and agreeing to represent them, you are then directed by a distress call to talk with the security chief Sugiyama, who then directs you to the CEO of Paradiso. As with the crew, after a brief meeting, the CEO decides to entrust a complete stranger, I reiterate, complete stranger, with the fate of the entire ship. And the options he presents do not represent small stakes. They could dramatically alter the lives of its inhabitants and present some clear moral dilemmas. You can either blow up the ship and collect a small reward of 6,500 credits in exchange, convince the colonists to settle, but as indentured servants to their corporate overlords, or provide them with the means to leave at the cost of either 25,000 or 40,000 credits, depending on your persuasion skill. At this point, I'm sure you guys are thinking, this doesn't seem like the worst set of choices and consequences. Like, come on, it's a video game. Maybe you should just ignore the absurdity of your character deciding this tremendous conflict and enjoy it. But there's one problem with that line of thinking. There are no interesting choices and consequences that both make sense for our player narrative and reward different playthroughs. You see, there might be 3 different alternatives, but only one ever makes any sense. The evil option seemingly misses the point of crime because it doesn't pay. Not only is the player forced into a tedious and long mission to internally rig the ship for destruction, the rewards for doing so are so minimal they might as well be non-existent. 6,500 credits will not buy you anything of value in Starfield. And this is a game where in every creche and enemy hideout, credits are abundant, or weapons to sell for them. At least in Fallout 3, the little extra credits the nuclear option provided in Megaton were a little help. Whereas in Starfield, it's tremendously evil, but seemingly reaps no payoff. The same applies to the less evil but still evil option. In this pathway, you have to convince the colonists to become indentured servants. Sounds alright, but for me, the way the plot unveils produces possibly the most absurd ending. At least with the evil option, you can achieve it with guile and brute force, but the idea that after a simple persuasion check, you can convince a whole group of strangers to enter indentured servitude with an authority they know nothing about is beyond ridiculous. And it gets worse. Not only are the rewards virtually non-existent for what is clearly an evil option, but you are required to engage in a tedious hunt to collect the materials for the new settlement. And so this leaves only one option that doesn't excessively waste our most essential resource, time. This, the supposedly good ending, involves convincing the colonists to settle elsewhere, and can simply be completed by paying for a grad drive for the new ship. All you have to exchange for the absence of tedium and unnecessary longevity that define the previous options is a decent chunk of credits. But to be honest, because there is so little payoff for even this option, I think the best option might just be to not complete the mission. A key aspect of good storytelling, namely long-run consequences, are absent. If you don't help the crew, or you help Paradiso instead, nothing will happen. Ultimately, it has no real consequences. At the same time, the lack of compelling character writing creates no other incentive to care about the future of either the Paradiso corporate elite or the colonists. The characters were so unmemorable, lacking in any sort of distinctive qualities, that when I was researching this quest for the video after my initial playthrough, I could barely remember the characters and not a single drop of nostalgia dripped through my my veins. And this gets onto my main issue of quests like First Contact. They are not only outdated, but almost a step back. The quest design in this title isn't slightly out of date, it's archaic, a time capsule from the mid to late 2000s. Oof, finally over. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. If you don't, send me your hate, I feed on negativity.